not all of the slides that I have for today are going to touch on all of these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the presentation that I have, and then I will go through these point by point and make sure I cover these topics that people wanted to hear about. So first, Olivia, thank you so much for inviting me to be with you all today. My name is Kristen Kasilek. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Mental Health Law and Policy here at USF. I've been here at USF for 2 years. I'm going into my third year. My program of research is actually focused on stigma surrounding mental illness and how it influences the lives of people with mental illness. And we're going to talk a little bit at the end about how it can function as a barrier to help seeking. But another kind of element of what I do is looking at promoting recovery among people with mental illness. And a big part of that is fostering social connectedness. And so I think perhaps, Olivia, that might be why you thought that I might be a good fit for this particular topic. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. This is how I've been doing class, and it seems to be working okay, because I am going to use a tool that many of you may have heard of before, called Poll Everywhere, to foster some engagement. So hopefully this might be a strategy that you could consider using with your students if you're in that capacity where you're working with students and needing to engage them, or your staff. So let me just start the presentation. Okay, so just so that everybody knows, I cannot see, one thing I've realized about this screen sharing is it's necessary to use Poll Everywhere, but I cannot see your hand if it's raised in the raise your hand function. So I say this to my students, and I'll say this here, I welcome anybody to just please interrupt me. I really love discussion during presentations. If you have questions, please feel free to chime in, and we can talk about them as we move through the material. So again, thank you, Olivia, for inviting me. The topic that we're covering today is building and maintaining social connection during COVID-19. So for those of you who may not have used this tool before, this is a tool called Poll Everywhere. So what you need to do is open up maybe another tab in the browser, in one of your browsers, your web browsers, and put in the website pollev.com/Kristen, which is my first name, KOSYL, and then 331, and that's up at the top of your screen. You should be able to see it. I'm going to give everybody just a moment to get there. While you're doing that, I'm going to talk a little bit about this tool, but what I want you to do once you get to this page is I want you to answer the question, what have you been doing to stay connected during COVID-19? And while you're finding your way there and putting in your answer to that question, I'll tell you a little bit about Poll Everywhere in case you're not familiar with this tool. For, I believe it's groups, so a classroom or maybe, or a working team of 25 or less, you can use this tool for free with limited functionality. Now, what I'm using today is the paid version of the tool because my classes are bigger than 25 students. I have found this really valuable to engage my students in the classroom. Even, one of the bullet points that you all asked me to talk about today was how to engage your students remotely. And this has, when you can't see their faces. So this has allowed me to do that. As you can see, as people are typing in their answers, they're popping up on the screen. So virtual game nights, FaceTime with high school and college friends, Zoom and FaceTime, video games. So a lot of suggestions that we're getting are reliant on technology. And I know that there was some desire to hear about alternatives to that as well. But that's the beauty of technology. We're finding now that it can foster social connectedness. Texting new people and acquaintances over the phone, calling family and relatives, spending time with a handful of friends and family who are also working from home, team chats and phone calls. So this spending time with a handful of people, you may have heard this referred to as pods. So for example, I have a little one who is turning 4 years old today. I can't believe it. And she is actually back in childcare now, a very small childcare setting. And we are fortunate in that we feel comfortable now limiting our social interaction to that pod of families that is in her daycare, since they're exposed to one another at school anyway. So she'll be having a tiny birthday party with her pod this weekend. Zoom happy hours, telephone calls to family and friends, Zoom in the phone. Going to parks with my dog and waving to people from afar. I love that. And that's also a great suggestion for social connectedness while getting away from the screen. And that piece about waving to people from afar, I'm going to touch on that at the end and see what thoughts you might have on that. Social distance lunches under shade of oak trees in my front yard. Oh, that sounds wonderful. Everybody brings a brown bag. That's great. Depending on your level of comfort, I know that the physical distancing issue can become highly politicized. So I want to make sure that I'm respectful of all, where everybody's at in terms of their comfort with connection. But outside gatherings are what is being suggested are the safest gatherings. And 6 feet of distance or more. And you can do that and still feel like you're physically present with people. So that's great. So I'm seeing that the entries have slowed down in class. I would just take this as a sign that people are done contributing. But this is just one way that I have found that's worked well to engage students in my classroom during this time of physical distancing while using teams to teach. And I teach completely synchronously. So everybody is all together at one time and they're seeing these roll in and we talk about their answers as they're coming in. One-on-one hanging out in the pool. Pool's actually a great idea. An outdoor activity, especially here in Florida where it's really humid and hot. And so you're able to be comfortable and do your physical distancing outdoors. That's great. So I will go ahead and move on. So why is social connection so important? Well, first, what is social connection? Well, the definition I actually have for you is social isolation, but we can look at we can flip it and look at the definition of social connection. So social isolation is defined as disengagement from social ties, institutional connections, or community participation. So if we flip that, social connection is defined as engagement in social ties, institutional connections, or community participation. Social connection is important. We need to be embedded in high quality relationships, and feeling that connection to other people in our lives is associated with actually decreased risk for all-cause mortality, as well as a range of disease morbidities. So what does that mean? Being socially isolated can be hazardous to your health and can be lethal. The magnitude of the association, so the size of the relationship between social connectedness and morbidity and mortality, so disease morbidity and death rates, is actually comparable to many of the leading other determinants of morbidity and mortality, which receive significant public health resources. So just one example of this, smoking is recognized as a big risk factor for mortality and morbidity. And there's a lot of public health money that goes into trying to help people to quit smoking. But we don't see quite as much being pumped into social connectedness. So I will say, as a researcher, I'm obviously constantly on the lookout for potential funding for my own research. And a great deal of funding has more recently, research funding has more recently gone to examining why social connection is so important and the impact of social connection or social isolation on individuals' health, but then also how to foster social connection particularly during COVID. So it's often defined in the research that's done in social connection, it's often defined based on public health priorities. So looking at how social connection influences, for example, disease, morbidity, and mortality, those are public health priorities. And the majority of the more recent literature on social connection is looking at those sorts of outcomes, though there's a lot of other sorts of outcomes like psychological outcomes. And then it's important to recognize that being socially connected is actually evolutionarily advantageous. So humans separated from their tribes, for example, often suffered severe consequences for that, you know, being more vulnerable to attack, maybe. And so we have evolved to be a species that relies on social connectedness for our health and well-being. Okay.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Yeah, that is wonderful. Yes, let me come back to camera so I can see your face. If I can, there we go.
Sure.
Okay.
Can you see me clearly now?
I can.
It's a little dark in here, sorry. So I actually took physical biological anthropology and undergrad, and I learned like quite a bit of a deal in that class. And after I kind of came out of that class, I never understood why we have such a stigma against like psychology and just like mental health in general. Like when you look at psychology, it's an extremely young science, probably 200 years, I believe, 200, 250. Yeah. It just doesn't have that much like respect or, you know, reverence as other sciences that have been well established for thousands of years. And of course, because of that, there's really not much, well, because we're kind of in the nascence of it, we have so much to discover with it. But I never understood, like, do you think it's just like sort of kind of cultural attitudes over time that kind of sort of like downplayed the importance of just like social connectedness like over time? Because when I look at like physical anthropological texts and everything like that, they're always stressing how we basically evolved like our consciousness and basically our humanity from social connection, and we were able to sort of store information, you know, across multiple people instead of just in our minds or writing it down. You know, word of mouth, you know, things like that. Communicating was like a way we could sort of have kind of an external hard drive of just human knowledge and sort of kind of pick back up on it when we were born and then add to it, and then like it just sort of exponentially like added that much like knowledge to our brains like much more quicker than any individual animal could. So I don't understand like why there's just such a huge stigma about it. I don't know if it's just mainly like, like I guess from a historical standpoint, I don't understand.
And you're talking about a stigma towards mental health, is what you're talking about, like, mental illness?
Or, well, a stigma towards just like taking psychology and social connectedness and mental health seriously, like all three of them, like anything with psychology, just like regarding collectiveness and, you know, being social connected. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to take a shot at addressing that, and thank you so much. That's very interesting points that you're making. I'm going to take a shot at answering this from the perspective of my work in researching stigma. So stigma is actually a process where we are aware of stereotypes that exist about a particular identity. So in this case, we could be talking about mental illness, for example, but this could be any marginalized identity. Once it's hard not to be aware of stereotypes. We become aware of them throughout our lifespan through largely the media. So that could be news media, print or digital, and it could also be entertainment media, so movies and TV shows that perpetuate stereotypes. So a really common stereotype surrounding mental illness, for example, is dangerousness. Oftentimes when we hear of a tragic event, like maybe a shooting that happens, the very next thing that's mentioned is the mental health status of the shooter, or at least alluded to that it's under investigation. And that pairing is artificial, actually, because what research suggests is that people are actually much more likely, who have a mental health condition, are much more likely to be victimized by crime than perpetrate a crime. So if we use that criteria of mental illness to identify the next quote unquote school shooter, then we would have a whole lot of false positives, people who are, identified as having mental illness and therefore a risk when really they're not a risk at all. So those stereotypes give rise to an emotional reaction, which is what we call prejudice. So if we think that somebody is dangerous because they have a mental health condition, we tend to fear them. When I say we, I mean in general, the population endorses these stereotypes and these prejudicial emotions, responses. And then what's really important is that the third component of the stigma process is discrimination. And so that is when we behave differently towards people with a stigmatized identity as a result of the stereotypes and the prejudice. So in this example with mental illness, we think somebody's dangerous because of those stereotypes that are perpetuated by the media. Therefore, we fear them, and as a result, we do not connect with them socially. So this is kind of how that area of research connects with this particular topic. Is so the flip side of understanding stigma is addressing it. And I mentioned that part of what my research looks at is how to reduce those stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination in order to promote connectedness, particularly among people with mental illness. So that's kind of, I hope that sort of gets at what you were asking, Wesley, that's why. And you were talking, from an anthropological perspective, you were talking about evolution, and stereotypes have a function. They're evolutionarily advantageous in social relationships. If we had to, every single time we had a social interaction, break down each category that interaction partner might fall within, and do a calculation in our head to be able to interact with them in a certain way that matches all of those different categories, it would take us forever to have social interactions. And so that's the function of stereotypes. But when stereotypes become problematic is when they result in discrimination. We all have bias. I remember, I guess probably in my younger years, hearing people say things like, I don't have a racist bone in my body. And now as a stigma researcher, I would say, yeah, that's not true. We all have biases. It is how we recognize and respond to them that is important. And that's what's going to help to promote social interactions, particularly for groups with marginalized and stigmatized identities. Does that sort of get at what you were talking about, Wesley?
Yeah, because I understand that from like a modern perspective, but like I guess that sociological aspect has spanned like a longer time than I've ever thought. And when I really think about it, like I do think in context of sort of kind of like, understanding that we do need social connectedness to some level, I do think there has been some counteracting forces in history that says, no, we should not really, we should be wary about who we associate with. And there's sort of kind of like this teeter-totter of just like balancing like how much social connectedness is beneficial versus how much, isolation is beneficial, in a sense of being confined to one group, quote unquote, or however you define it. And it's just interesting how we can still have so many biases just naturally, just from society. But when you kind of learn it, you learn at it from like a genetic sense, and then like an anthropological sense. Like there's just so much, the variance between quote unquote major races on the earth is just so high, and the spread is so large, it's hard to clearly define discrete categories. Even though phenotypically, yes, there are discrete differences, but genotypically it's really messy. So I guess, I understand where you're coming from, but yeah, we do all have biases from a sociocultural standpoint. But
yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for your answer. It was really interesting.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the question. Okay, um, so continuing on to talk about the importance of social connectedness. We were just talking about what are the consequences of social isolation in terms of morbidity and mortality. And actually, the study that's on the right hand side, figures from the study, I should say, on the right hand side of the slide here, this was looking at controlling for other factors that might contribute to morbidity and mortality, including various health conditions. What is the survival rate of people in the course of months who are socially isolated? And the top is females, the bottom is males. And so this is looking at, like, the dark lines here are the most socially isolated people, whereas these top, they fall in the order you would expect them to. And the top line are people who are not socially isolated at all. So you can see that even after controlling for other factors that lead to morbidity and mortality, social isolation contributes to survival, or I guess it causes a lack of survival, you should say. In contrast, improving social connectedness has been shown to contribute to improved quality of life. It helps people to live longer. It boosts the mental health of the population. So, for example, people who perceive their social support to be insufficient are more likely to experience depression and anxiety. This is a correlation. So we can then, look at it as people who perceive their social connection to be sufficient have better mental health or less depression or anxiety. It also decreases the risk for suicide. So one study that looked at this in particular found that greater social connection was associated with lower suicide risk after controlling for all those other risk factors that are commonly looked at as risk factors for suicide, things like alcohol abuse and dependence and serious mental illness. So this is just making the case that social connection is really important. So then the question becomes, how has COVID impacted social connection? And I mean, this is a hot topic. We hear it, I've heard it in the media a lot. This is one Health Affairs article written by a researcher in social connection. So somebody who does their research in this area. And I thought this was so powerful, referring to this as the double pandemic. So it's the pandemic of the virus, but then there's also the pandemic of social isolation. And a lot of my current work, I was fortunate enough, along with my colleague in social work here at USF, Dr. Jerome Gallia, to be funded through one of the Pandemic Research Response Network COVID-19 awards in the most recent round. And we have done a lot of background work looking at the impact of COVID on mental health as a result of social isolation and factors that are associated with the social isolation and the need for social distancing in order to mitigate the spread of the virus, which have led to things like job loss and economic insecurity that are contributing to poor mental health. So our grant is looking at developing a chatbot technology to screen and refer actually first responders is the group we're starting with to get them into mental health care that is aligned with their preferences and their needs. So we recognize this is so important. I thought that the way this was framed was really, really powerful. But the fact is that social isolation and loneliness were prevalent prior to COVID-19, and particularly for certain populations. So for people with serious mental illnesses, the group that I focus on, certainly this is the case largely because of the stigma we were just talking about. But also we can think of other examples of groups that are particularly impacted by social isolation, even prior to the pandemic. So one group that is often talked about as needing attention in this area are older adults. So efforts to reduce the spread of the virus because of stay-at-home orders and quarantine and social distancing recommendations have exacerbated this already serious problem. It's led to increased distress, and the immediate effects have already been observed. So some of the statistics that I cite, like I cited in the proposal that we put in for the COVID funding, was the fact that between March and April, I believe, when the pandemic initially kind of hit in the US, and a month later, there was a 1,000-fold increase in calls to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. We have extended data now on that, and we're continuing to see this impact. In fact, the way that Dr. Galia and I have been referring to the mental health impact of the pandemic is the fourth wave. So long after the impact of the virus itself, we're going to be dealing with sustained mental health impacts. But there's ways that we can help buffer against this and hopefully promote better outcomes among the population in terms of mental health by fostering social connection. So that's the end of the doom and gloom story. I say that jokingly, but seriously at the same time, is that my goal here with you today is not to make you feel like this is hopeless. We're doomed to poor mental health as a result of social isolation. In fact, some of my current work, I've done a survey with undergraduate students here at USF. We did it over the summer. My research lab and I and a couple of other colleagues, and what we found is, so this is a scale called the brief cope, which is a really commonly used coping measure in various areas of research. We were interested in whether or not, or how I should say, our college students were coping. Not sure how these words made it over to this side, so please excuse that. I'm not sure why they're over there, but really they should be up here. What you're seeing highlighted is the important pieces. These are domains on the brief cope that were above the midpoint on this scale. So each domain on the brief cope is made up of 2 items. And those 2 items add together to score to make this coping, active coping, for example, or acceptance as a form of coping, or the use of humor. And because it's 2 items, the original items are on a 4-point scale. So when you add them together, it's a range of 2 to 8. So that it's 1 to 4 comes 2 to 8. So anything above a 4 here is highlighted. That's just kind of an arbitrary way of just doing a general look at this data. And what you're seeing is most of these are highlighted. Most of the positive coping behaviors or adaptive coping behaviors are highlighted. Actually, venting in this scale is classified not as an adaptive coping behavior. And I think that's interesting. I think that might be not a problem with the scale, but something we should think about, because sometimes venting can be very helpful. Why I've placed stars over here is these I thought were most related to social connectedness. So most of the students we surveyed are making use of emotional support. They're availing instrumental support. So the difference between emotional and instrumental is instrumental might be they're going to a faculty member if they're having trouble using Teams, right? They're getting that type of support in completing a goal, participating in class, whereas emotional support is leaning on another person during times of emotional distress. And then venting is, venting, complaining, this is hard. And they're using that strategy above a 4, so more often. Now this is not adaptive, self-blame. So there are some areas that we need to be looking at in terms of helping improve coping skills during COVID. And these questions were asked particularly within the context of COVID. How are you coping during this time of physical distancing as a result of COVID-19? What we did for this study is I also recognize that with the brief cope, some of the more, I guess, modern ways that people might cope with physical distancing aren't measured, and technology is a big piece of that. And so we asked an additional set of questions that was aimed at developed by looking at literature that has come out so far on coping with COVID that suggests that people are using technology and those sorts of things to connect. And we asked people to respond to those questions. So this is on a scale of 1 to 4. So anything above a 2 is highlighted. So you can see that these students were compulsively checking COVID-related news. I would probably think that's not an adaptive coping strategy, but they've been talking frequently with their family and their friends. They've been using technology such as Zoom or Facebook to keep in touch. And when I asked the question at the beginning, many of you are doing the same thing. They've been making sure to get adequate sleep. I giggled a little when I saw that because I was like, when I was in undergraduate, I wonder how I would have defined adequate sleep. They've been sleeping too much as well, right? So that kind of goes hand in hand. And then also exercising regularly, which is really important. So another, to the point that somebody wanted me to address about how to get outside of the house, engaging in a regular exercise routine that's outdoors is really a great idea. And then praying. So people are leaning on their religion and their spirituality during this time. I'm gonna, in the interest of time, focus on the ones with the stars right now because they're related to social connectedness. Spending more time on social media. So at least anecdotally, in my own experience, hearing the news media reporting on social media use, it's oftentimes demonized. And certainly there are some negative effects of too much social media use. However, there's studies that have been done on social comparison and its negative effects as a result of social media use and kind of portraying this life that doesn't really exist. And so those social comparisons can be damaging. But now more than ever, I think we're seeing some of the positive aspects of social media in order to foster connectedness during this time. Okay. We also, I'll just mention this really quick because it's not directly related to this talk. We also looked at differences between groups on the COPE scores. So we looked at students with mental illness and students without mental illness. Excuse some of these formatting issues. This paper is actually just about ready to go out for review. So I'm happy to be doing this with you because you're helping me to catch all these little typos. But what we're looking at here is the factors. So maladaptive coping. Students with mental illness are using more maladaptive coping strategies than students without a mental illness. So that's important. What does that mean? That means that if we are in a capacity here at USF, in USF Health, where we're helping to support students, we need to be keeping a close eye on those students who we know had already, even prior to the pandemic, been struggling because they may need some additional supports. But I find this really interesting is that students with mental illness are actually utilizing more emotional support than students without. How do we explain this? Well, in our discussion section, we were going to talk about the fact that many times students with mental illness have been using some form of psychotherapy, talk therapy, or support to help them to deal with their symptoms. And potentially because of that, they are more accustomed to being used to availing those types of supports than students who maybe haven't experienced that before and are just now in the pandemic experiencing the need to use those sorts of supports. Same goes for instrumental support. Students with mental illness were more likely to use venting as a coping strategy, also more likely to use substances as a coping strategy. So that's really important to note as well. And then also to self-blame. And there could be a relationship there with, students who experience a mental illness, perhaps depression, are also, because of their depression, more likely to engage in self-blaming activity. We also looked, and this is not ideal, I realize, with a small sample size, and I didn't mention the sample size, I don't think, but we surveyed 161 students. So with a small sample size like this, we can't really look at the mediating effects of race very well, or ethnicity very well, because the sample sizes the sample size is too small, essentially. So the best way we can do it with a sample of the size is white students versus students of color. And I know that is not ideal, but it's what we can do with this data. And so what we did is we looked at white students versus students of color, and we found that students of color were more likely to be using religious coping mechanisms during COVID. White students were more likely to be using substances. So here is something that we might be able to support among students of color, is continued use of this adaptive coping strategy. And here among white students, we might need to be addressing substance use during COVID. We should be addressing it for all students, but particularly we're seeing there's a difference where white students are using substances more to cope. And then finally, we looked at differences between males and females. So you can see that males are more likely to be using humor. Females are more likely to use religious coping and also to engage in self-blame. So the implications being, we want to keep an eye on females in terms of their self-blaming. Okay, so tips for staying connected during COVID. There's a resource. I'm going to share with Olivia, if that's okay with you, Olivia, the slide deck for today. So you'll be able to click on this link that's in the presentation. I've done quite a bit of work with the director of this collaborative. It's the Temple University Collaborative on Community Inclusion. It is a National Institute on Disability and Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research funded training center at Temple University, led by Dr. Mark Salzer. And they put out, so their focus is on promoting community inclusion among people with serious mental illness. But I'm just going to say that what works for people with serious mental illness is also going to be effective for people that are not living with a serious mental illness. And so they put out this resource when COVID first hit to help people with serious mental illness engage in social connectedness despite staying apart. So keeping connected while staying apart. So it'd be worth exploring this. One thing I did notice when I was putting this presentation together is that the links within this manual are not working correctly. And so I'm going to reach out to Dr. Salzer to see if he can send me a copy of the manual where the links are working, and I'll make sure to share that with you if I'm able to get a hold of it. I think it's particularly important because there is actually an assessment link in there where, to me, it appears that you're able to click on it and take an assessment to see how you're coping, what coping mechanisms you're using, and then it gives tips for more adaptive coping strategies. Okay, so getting into kind of concrete examples of how to remain socially connected during while being physically distanced. Now, I didn't know this until I was doing research for this talk, so thank you for that. That Netflix has something called Netflix Party that you can participate in, where you can watch on your computer a movie and have a chat running in the same screen, so that you can do movie night anywhere across the globe, essentially. Now, one of the things I like about that manual that Temple University put out is they do acknowledge that there are some technological challenges that people might face, like no internet connectivity and or maybe not being comfortable with the use of technology. And so the manual would be really helpful in those situations. Most of the recommendations that I'm going to share on these slides are need technology to function well. This is one that I've personally used when the pandemic first hit. My family, my parents, my niece and my sisters and my nephew would all get on, and my own family here would all get on this house party social network site, and you can play virtual games with one another. And we just had a blast doing that. So that would be something to do. Now, there is a cost associated with this. So we have to keep that in mind and provide different alternatives that are low cost or no cost. This one is no cost. There is a subscription option, but in order to do a shared playlist on Spotify, the music app, you can do this with friends and it's free. And so you can create a shared playlist, add your friends to it, and then everybody can add their own songs. Music tends to foster conversation. So it'd be really interesting to do a qualitative study looking at the songs that people are adding and how that's reflective of how they're feeling. But also a great way to connect with your friends and share what you're going through right now in the form of music. So after kind of scraping through the internet and coming up with some of these ideas, some of which I knew, some of like the house party app and some of which I didn't, what I did is I crowdsourced this. I mean, obviously this is a small crowdsourcing sample, but I crowdsourced my 30-person undergraduate course in recovery-oriented mental health services. And I asked, what are you guys doing you as a group doing to foster social connectedness? So one of my students said, and I love this idea, she said using Facebook chat, but you could use Zoom, you could use Teams, that she's with her mother doing one night a week, they're cooking the same meal. So they're both ordering the same set of ingredients or going to the store and picking up the same set of ingredients and cooking a meal together, a new meal together. And I think that's great because it's fostering, it's a hobby. It's you're learning something new, a new recipe, and then there's the social connection aspect as well. Another student told me that they're having family dinner nights once a week, that they were accustomed to prior to COVID, having Sunday dinners with their family. I could relate to that a lot because I grew up in the same town that I went to undergraduate in, and we had family dinners on Sundays still. And I know I would have missed that if I couldn't be with my family. So they're doing that virtually. That looks like some really good mac and cheese too. Gaming. I think somebody mentioned that as in the first question that people are participating in gaming. And again, I do feel like the media tends to demonize kind of these technological means of connection like social media and gaming. But I think that we're recognizing now that there are some pluses to these ways of connecting, though we, like anything, we have to be aware that there could be negative consequences as well. I thought this was really interesting. I didn't know how else to illustrate this, but a student told me that their friend is an artist and they're doing kind of like a choose your own adventure thing over Instagram. So actually this was, I think back in 2014, Macmillan, the publishing company, used Instagram to try to create excitement among young people, like high school age youth, in a new book series. The book is called 13. Not familiar with that, so I hope that it's not a problematic series or something. If it is, that wasn't my intent. But what they did is they had people interact with these hashtags. So one of my students said her friend is an artist and doing something similar, where they're kind of doing a choose your own adventure / what piece of art should she create next? And I thought that was a creative way of connecting. One of the things I hadn't planned on talking to my students about was how much they miss touch. And I started thinking about, because this is not my area of research, what is the importance of touch? So here's just one article, and one article does not tell us much. But there is some literature out there that suggests that touch is important in promoting things like attachment or a sense of security. So what this study did is compared two conditions, actually 4 conditions, I'm sorry. So it's either a partner or a friend, a close friend. And in the touch condition, people were asked to imagine either sitting next to a romantic partner or sitting next to a friend on the sofa, visualizing how they're sitting, imagining the person touching them, putting their hand around them. And then in the control condition, they were asked to imagine they were standing next to a wall with their partner, and they were asked to describe the wall, something that you wouldn't think would foster any feelings of social connectedness. And what they found was that there was a significant increase or significant difference in the touch condition for both close friend and romantic partner, in the amount of security words that they were able to remember. So they were given these words before they started this activity and asked to recall them. That's a common way of manipulating conditions and looking at the influence of those conditions on things that we're trying to measure, like social connectedness. So people were able to recall these security words more in the touch group versus the no touch group. So this tells us that touch is quite important. But right now we're being advised pretty consistently and constantly that we should be avoiding that means of connection. So I talked with my students about, well, what can you do instead? And they said things like, instead of the handshake or the fist bump, they're doing the elbow bump. And you may have seen political figures doing this. I thought this mask was cute, so that's why I put that on there. Air hug. And I did this with a colleague the other day, mentioning the physically distanced outdoor lunches. I met a colleague for the first time since COVID, and I said, it's so hard not to hug you. Let's just do air hug. And so that's kind of what you're seeing here is, this was actually, the caption was of an older adult's home and a nursing facility. And obviously they're reaching out to one another, kind of simulating the hug. And just to put a little bit of humor in here at the end, if anybody's familiar with the Big Bang Theory, I'm a fan of that show. My dad is a physicist and he is not a fan of that show. Here we have Raj and Howard, and they've built these machines that are able to simulate touch between one another. And it was a humorous episode. So what's important, the plug I have to put in here because of the work that I do is that social connectedness or a lack of social connectedness can contribute to mental illness, or the experience of mental distress at the very least, and that the stigma surrounding mental illness can keep people from seeking help. So there's a variety of resources that are out there. I can't believe that the one resource I left off is our counseling center, but it is a very great resource. I have heard nothing but wonderful things about the counseling center, and I have a collaborative relationship, actually, that COVID proposal I was mentioning. The counseling center's director, Dr. Strader, is a partner on that proposal. Free services to USF students. NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, has a helpline where people can go to get information, resources, and support. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. In the interest of time, I'm not going to ask to pause and do this, but I'm going to say that the Suicide Prevention Lifeline number isn't exactly the easiest to remember. So putting it in your phone under a contact would be a great idea, either for yourself or maybe to offer it up to somebody else who might need it. Consequently, there are efforts underway, and I'm not sure where they're at in this process right now, to make a 911 like number. And I want to say I don't think it's going to be 211. It might be something like 411, which would be like connect to the Suicide Prevention Lifeline to make that easier to remember. There is actually also a crisis text line that you might make use of if you don't want to actually talk to somebody. You could text with them. That is all that I had in terms of my slides. I know that I talked a little bit longer than I had planned to, but I hope it was helpful. I'm going to go to these tips, Olivia, unless you think I should take questions first, if anybody has any. I know that we only have 5 minutes left, and I'm happy to stay on a few minutes longer if people want that.
Yeah, I would say go over what you were going to finish, and then if people have questions, you can either post them in the chat or, stay on longer and we can answer questions.
Okay, perfect. So tips for building connections without screens. I love that. And I actually, when you first said that, I was like, oh goodness, I should have put some more options in there. Crowdsourced, and it seems like a lot of people are using the technology. at least for me, I can just speak from my own experience. Some of you even suggested this at the beginning when I asked the question. Making outdoors, making use of the outdoors, being together, though 6 feet apart outside, is relatively safe. In fact, if you Googled my name, if you had any just why you would want to do that, I don't know, but if you did, I gave an interview for the Tampa Bay Times maybe a month or two ago, and the topic was on social connection during COVID. And actually the reporter, she uses a lot of humor in her reporting, wanted to know why all of a sudden it seems like everybody has just forgotten that the pandemic is there and they're going back to life as usual. And I tried carefully to make the point that we need to recognize right now that everybody is weighing the pros and the cons of the decisions that they're making to keep themselves, their family, and our community safe. And hopefully, if nothing else, the material I presented here to you today has shown that social isolation can be just as deadly as some other forms of disease. And so that's not to say that we just throw caution to the wind and have huge house parties and all of that. But it just means that we need to have empathy for the choices that people make in terms of going ahead and making those social connections in person. And then there's things that we can do to make that happen in a safe way. Riding bikes on opposite sides of the street, right? Other things that don't involve technology. I just think that the suggestions that you all made about some carefully physically distanced options are great ones. And then the other thing that we have to acknowledge is an option or a choice to all of us is that idea of pods. So having a small group of people that you trust that is not exposing themselves to potentially being exposed to the virus. There's some level of risk in all of these choices. And I'm not advocating one strategy over another, but I'm just saying that these are choices. These are options that we have as human beings. We have autonomy and the right to self-determination and to be able to make those choices as we see fit. So hopefully that touches on that a bit. Tips for presenting remotely without seeing faces. So right now I'm seeing a lot of static pictures and initials. Here's what I do as an instructor. I don't know if it's right or wrong. I've thought about it carefully though, and this is very intentional. I highly encouraged my students on the first day of class to turn their cameras on. Most of them do, maybe not the entire class, but at least when they're speaking, they turn their camera on. And I really appreciate that. I think it has honestly done so much good. I have to admit that entering into the semester, I adore teaching. I love teaching. Thank you, Wesley. Glad you enjoyed. I was scared that my students were not going to be engaged this semester, and they're actually so engaged. And I think part of that is the camera use, that we're seeing one another. I can see their facial expressions. Olivia just turned on her camera. Hopefully I didn't guilt her too much. So I think that is really important. I'll pause for a moment because I know that we're at 12:59. As I said, I'm happy to keep addressing. I have like 5 or 6 more points that are on my list that you had asked to be addressed. And I'm more than happy to do that. But if you need to sign on, is it okay if we go over a little bit, Olivia? Okay, so
yes.
Great. Okay, so if you need to jump off, no offense taken. I'm glad that you could join us. I'd welcome you to connect with me if you have additional questions, or I'm always interested in collaborations. I failed to put my email address on the slide, but I will type it into the chat box right now so that you'll have it. There it is. Thanks, Kristen. Okay. Engaging groups remotely. So I think the key word here, if I remember right, was groups. Teams, awesome for this. I don't know if you all know this yet, but there is a new function in Teams that I actually haven't experimented with yet called breakouts. So you can actually engage groups in that way where you can pose a question. And this doesn't have to be in a classroom. This could be in a staff meeting. You can pose a question and then have people break out into different rooms in order to engage that way. If there's more that you want to hear on that, let me know. That's the most I can think of to comment on that one. Helping friends, again, keeping that number for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline in your phone. I do, even though I presented statistics to you that show that in general, at least they're reporting that they're coping well. Students are reporting that, there could be some social desirability things going on there as well, meaning that they're responding in the way they think that I want them to respond, even though it was completely anonymous. Even though students are saying they're coping well, I have to tell you, I've seen some students, particularly over the summer, who are experiencing significant distress. Thanks, Joseph, for joining us. So how do you help them if a friend is experiencing distress? There's programs out there actually that are designed to train you to do this. So if anybody is familiar with mental health first aid, that is one such program that trains you to identify signs and symptoms of mental illness and also signs and symptoms that somebody might be in a crisis, and to get them to the appropriate professional help. So it's not training you to be a mental health provider, but training you to be a gatekeeper to professional mental health care. So getting trained in a program like that would be a really great idea. Having that new National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number in your phone. One of the things that you would learn if you participated in mental health first aid is how to ask the question. A lot of times we're fearful that if we ask somebody about suicide, we're putting the thought in their head. It's actually not true. The worst thing that you can do if you're at all concerned about somebody is not ask. And then it also trains you in good ways of asking the question. So it's very different if I say, "You're not thinking about suicide, are you?" from, "Are you having thoughts of suicide?" There's a judgment implicit in the first one, right? And so you just want to be able to ask openly and clearly about whether or not they are thinking of suicide. What mental health first aid has you do is practice asking the question, because there is a muscle memory that we have. And the first time we ask something, it's super awkward, right? But as we get practice in asking it, hopefully you never actually have to ask that question. But given the prevalence rates of mental health conditions and suicide, chances are you will at some point in your life if you haven't already have to ask somebody that question. I am a trained mental health first aid facilitator. So if I sound like I'm advertising, I don't get any dividends. I don't get paid for facilitating those sessions, but I do believe in the benefit of that program. Coping with being in the house all the time. I'm not sure the person who wanted to hear this point talk to if there's specific reasons why you might feel the need to be indoors all the time. Like maybe you have really bad allergies, or I can think of there's lots of reasons. Maybe you're in a high risk category. But if you can get outdoors, even if it's just for a little bit of time every day, I think it's important. And then also, all of those other strategies that when you are indoors, like if we have bouts of rain, that you can connect with others that are under similar circumstances and can relate. How can supervisors maintain connections? I'll give props to my department on this one. Greg Teague is the chair of mental health law and policy. I don't want to leave anybody out, but I think there were 3 key figures in making this happen. Dr. Amber Gum is a professor in my department and does a lot of kind of leadership work in our department. And Nikki Zen is an instructor in our department. And when COVID hit, I think it was just the 3 of them decided that they were going to have what is called Mental Health Law and Policy Cafe. And so we have a team set up in teams where you can go if you want every week or every other week. I think it is right now. We moved it to a little less frequent because of other demands on our time. There's no agenda. That's the thing that I think is really important about what they did is there's no agenda. There's no list of to-dos that we're going through in this meeting. It is a virtual water cooler is what it is. And I have to tell you, it has personally helped me so much to know that I don't have to go. Like, I think there's one scheduled or there's one scheduled for next week or was one scheduled for this week that I didn't go to because I had too much to do and I couldn't make it. Just like sometimes in reality, when we're in the office, sometimes we're so busy, we just have to close our office doors for a couple minutes to get a couple things done without being interrupted. That's just life. But then we can open up that door and join our colleagues at the water cooler and have that social connection. And I really appreciate the fact that my department has done that. I think that could be replicated across campus in other settings. The grad student asked a question about being in a small department and developing friendships. And I wish I would have mentioned this before some of the other people jumped off the call. I encouraged my students in my classes to try to utilize teams to form some groups that could be social in nature. They could be study groups, but this is the best proxy for the time before class or the time after class, right? Where you might normally start to chat about casual things. It could be about your assignments, but that might lead to talking about your favorite sports team or other topics. So I would encourage thinking about that. Actually, I chatted with my students today about this. I find this interesting. One of the things that myself, and I know a lot of other people have been doing this during COVID, is trying to find silver linings. And so, this has been a really challenging time for everybody, challenging more so for some than others. But one of the silver linings actually in behavioral health care that I'm hearing is that telehealth has removed some barriers for folks for which maybe transportation used to be a barrier to services. They now can engage more virtually. It's also raised some barriers for those that don't have access to the technology. But similarly with social relationships, whereas one might experience some anxiety walking up to somebody in class when you're brand new, somehow using technology sometimes can help break that barrier down, right? And so we're a little less fearful to do that virtually than we might be in person. And then remember that this will not last forever. There will be a time when we will be physically together again. There might be changes in place, things might change. There might be a new normal, but we'll be together again. And formulating those friendships now, then you can have those physical friendships later on when we're able to be together. So I hope that helps a little bit. I would really use that and reach out to your faculty and say, would you, if you feel comfortable instigating it, maybe the faculty would make an announcement in class that they recognize that this is a time when we're in dire need of social connectedness and that they would encourage and support students to do these sorts of things. I apologize for the dog. I went almost the entire time without that. And then staff fostering relationships with students. Can't remember exactly what, I think it was just that question. How do we foster relationships with students virtually? And I think the same way that we're doing so right now is connecting on things like Teams or Zoom. Even just checking up with students via email. I will tell you as an instructor, as a faculty member, that it means so much to students to just get that email reaching out and asking if everything is going okay. It can be a little demanding on our time, but I also think that it speaks volumes to the students about our level of empathy and how much we care. So I think that's it. I'm going to mute myself. I apologize again for the barking in the background, one of the joys of working from home. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'm just really grateful for having had the opportunity to talk with you all. And I'll make sure that I get Olivia the PowerPoint slides and the resource from the Community Inclusion Collaborative.
So I don't see any questions. We can wait, a couple more minutes in case anybody has anything, but thank you so much for presenting to us today. And, I learned a lot of really great new information, covered a wide range of topics. And so I'm hoping others took something away from it as well.
Thanks again for having me, Olivia. It was wonderful having you all. Thanks for spending some time learning about this topic.